and lightning. The Continental Drifters story. Some of you may remember the Continental Drifters, a fine roots band, what they would now call Americana band from, I guess, the 80s into the 90s. Never quite cracked the top 10 or the big hit list, the hit parade, and so they didn't get the rock stardom that we may think of, but they were all, the members of that band were members of other bands, including the Bangles. One guy played in R.A.M., DBs, we're going to talk about that. I sat down to read this book, Sean, quite honestly, and I thought, I remember the Continental Drifters, but I don't know, it's 200-something pages. I got to about page 3 and I was hooked. It's a beautiful, wonderful story, and not the usual kind of rock and roll Learjet stuff. These were just regular folks grinding away at it, and quite lovable, and also had great memories. There's all kind of detail in this book. Y'all please welcome Sean Kelly. Man, you show up, we get food and chairs.
And chicken.
And chicken. You gotta come back, Sean Kelly. All right, this band, like I said, they were known as the working class Fleetwood Mac.
I mean, not to take credit for it, maybe it was the first, I kind of...
You made that up?
I think so.
I'll go ahead and comment, man.
That was my elevator pitch for the book.
Yeah.
Working class Fleetwood Mac.
Well, they had 2 female singers, and then they had all these males, guys that could really play guitar, so, and the women could really harmonize.
Yep. So there you go.
To give the audience an idea of who we're talking about, tell us the bands that the Drifters were in that we've all heard of.
Yeah, so Continental Drifters, they formed in Los Angeles in 1991, and it started as this sort of like, a couple guys wanted to do a Tuesday night residency at this place, Raji's, and people started hearing about it, musicians from all over, so people would come to these things, and you know, kind of gradually, but not gradually, almost like some people joined the band who kind of like, they sort of like almost merged into the band without realizing they were part of the band, and those folks would be Vicki Peterson from the Bangles, Susan Cowsill from the Cowsills, and Peter Holsapple from the DBs, and he had just come off of a run with R.E.M. And so they were maybe like probably the most notable people in the Drifters' history. But everyone who was in the band had really notable careers before and after. And it was like a collective of people, really. It was just this kind of alchemy thing that they had. A lot of them were trying to get away from the music industry, kind of. That's what led them to this kind of divey little club, and just started playing each other's songs. And that's kind of what happened. But they all came from somewhere, really, and kind of were trying to get away from something, really, you know?
Yeah. At one point, they had the keyboard player from Hootie and the Blowfish. And so now they got to schedule their stuff around Hootie.
Yes,
at this point,
Peter
Hootie was huge.
Exactly, yeah. Peter had joined that band because they were big R.E.M. fans and also DB's fans. And they asked him, they were now the biggest band in the world, and we're like, we want Peter Holsapple to be the keyboard player. So the Drifters kind of had to dance around the Hootie schedule a bit for several years, and so that made the whole thing a little bit tricky, but they were also really big supporters of the Drifters and recorded a Drifters song and stuff, so it's kind of a mutual love affair kind of with that band.
One thing, there were many things eye-opening to me in this book, but one thing I just did not realize was out in LA in the early 90s, at a certain level, these clubs would make the bands pay to play. They didn't pay the bands, it was the other one. Yeah. Well, that's encouraging, isn't it?
Makes you want to be in a band.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was the thing about Raji's, was that Raji's did not do that, and there was nowhere else in LA that had that sort of setup. And you know, you would go into debt, basically. And Raji's, they didn't care. They didn't care, like they didn't take any of, they were like, can we charge a couple bucks at the door and keep the money, and you guys just sell the beer. They were like, yeah, sounds good. And very different from anything else that was happening out there. And the cool thing is, there's a really cool story about, it was Kirsty MacColl, the late great Kirsty MacColl, and her husband, who's a really renowned producer, and then a guy that he was producing at the time called Seal, who showed up at a Drifters show on a Tuesday night at Raji's. And you would get like Norm from Cheers showed up, the guy from Norm from Cheers would show up and stuff. The whole cast of 90210 or something at some point showed up. So it's just kind of this place where people just congregated and like just to see music. And Raji's is very famous for a lot of like punk shows and like Nirvana. There's an iconic photo of Nirvana there, but the Drifters had this Tuesday night kind of thing kind of locked down for about a year and a half, and it just became this groundswell of like excitement around this kind of rootsy band that was doing something different.
On Tuesday night, no less.
Yeah.
And I love that you have the detail in here about Raji's, with this club, only sold Budweiser in the bottle.
That's right.
Except when they had punk bands.
That's right.
Then they had cans.
Yes. That is an actual fact verified by a Raji's employee.
That's smart. All right, Carlo Nuccio,
Yeah.
if I'm saying that right. The book is dedicated to Carlo, and he is sort of the anti-hero of the book, sort of. He distinguishes himself. This is incredible, y'all. He's from New Orleans, one of those few musicians who's from there. And he was known for his drug taking and his drinking and for what a drummer he was. Now, for you to stand out in New Orleans for those two things, tell us about Carlo.
Well, he was also notable for being able to do all three things at once. There's several people who confirmed that for the book. Yeah, Carlo was like, larger than life was a term that kind of got thrown around a lot about him. He just ran in a lot of crazy circles in LA and New Orleans, and he just was like, he just played with everybody, and he really was like, his personality was really, could be very overbearing, and he was very opinionated, and it was, a lot of times very difficult to deal with, but he just had this thing, like, people wanted to work with him because they wanted their records to have that Carlo thing, and he played behind the beat, and it's just like there was this swagger kind of to it that nobody else really had. It was sort of like, he loved like John Bonham and those kind of rock drummers, but he had this kind of swing thing that was just very unique to him. And he started the band. The band really was his thing. And it was his vision, and it kind of also was his vehicle as a songwriter. He was an unbelievable songwriter and never got his due in that role. And he was incredible, and there are so many Carlos. I had to put a chapter about Carlo in the book, just about him, because there were so many stories from so many people.
Well, the story, one of the many, as you say, the one that gets me was he had the copyright on Who Dat.
He did.
You can do a lot of damage with that copyright.
He might have.
And somehow let it slip away. I don't know, the NFL slid in there and bought it out from under it.
I never got to specifically ask him about that, but I did ask his sister.
It's probably a very painful subject.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. Yeah.
How did you lose that copyright?
I know. Yeah, that would have been an interesting conversation. But yeah, that was a thing he did in the 80s, and then he co-wrote the Who Dat sort of like theme song, and got Aaron Neville, who was a friend of his, to sing on it and stuff. And he just led this like unbelievable life. It's kind of amazing.
Quite a character. All right, there's a whole little mini section on Oxford, Mississippi, which was, strangely enough, a really friendly town to the Continental Drifters. They love playing here. Tell us a little bit about that connection.
So I think the first thing they ever did in Oxford was open for Wilco. I think that was the first show they ever played. Yeah. And they, that connection was probably Blue Mountain, I'm guessing, because Lori and John. And they just kept coming back, and it became pretty apparent at some point that like there needed to be an Oxford section, if you will, because they just kept talking about Oxford and all the great memories of staying at I think the mayor's house or something, and this big wraparound porch and stuff. It was cool. Folks that I know, fairly well, like Garrison Starr, is from here, and was a friend of the Drifters. And they started a lot of relationships there. They had a lot of champions here in Oxford.
Yeah, I remember those years, and people just they were just one of those bands that they loved it here and people loved them, and I'd forgotten about the Wilco connection. And I didn't realize that they had stayed at our mayor's house until you wrote that in the book.
Yeah.
We'll find out about that later, I think. So, now, but I can't help but think, and of course, reading your book, I went back and listened to them, and there's also a companion CD. Let's don't forget it. We Are All Drifters, right? Produced by our own, or rather mixed by our own Jeffrey Reed.
Mastered by Jeffrey Reed.
Yeah, Jeffrey Reed put the sound on it.
Job.
So you can get other artists doing Continental Drifter songs, and I was listening to that and listening to the Drifters, and they're just great. So I'm thinking, why weren't they a bigger hit? They sort of invented what we now call Americana.
Yep.
They didn't know it was Americana. If they were in their 20s or so now, they'd probably be a pretty big time band, wouldn't they?
You would think so. I mean, and that was a lot of the intrigue was like, why didn't this band do more, or why weren't they bigger? And a lot of it comes down to they just kind of didn't want to. They knew what they didn't want out of being in the music industry, because they'd all kind of done it and they were tired of it basically. And it was just about community and family. And so that's kind of part of it. They did, they wanted to have a record deal and make records and be able, basically just somebody to give them money to make music, but like they didn't want any of the other stuff. They didn't want to have to compromise, and I think that probably held them back potentially from bigger opportunities. But that they didn't. They had other. There were, I think, bigger and better reasons for them to be a band than trying to be a bigger band than they were.
That's another reason why this book is so refreshing. All right, you're reading along, and you get toward the end of the book, and like I say, it's a family story. We've had, divorces. We've had kids being married. Being born. And in fact, when one of the band members has a kid, the whole band shows up in the waiting room, and they all sleep on top of each other like puppies.
Drunk. They were all drunk in the hospital.
And one of them sprawled on the floor, and a nurse keeps stepping over him, and she looks up at the mom-to-be and says, "Are you okay with this?"
Yeah.
And mom says, "Yeah," and the nurse says, "Okay." And she keeps stepping over the guy, too.
Yeah.
So we're reading along, and everything under the world can happen to this great band, and then Katrina happens. And they're all in different parts of the country. Some of them are there in New Orleans.
I believe everybody except Vicky. Vicky had moved back to Los Angeles by that point. The band, when that happened, they were no longer a band for a couple of years, and most of them were not speaking to each other actually at that point. There's a lot of that, and so that kind of displaced everybody. And there's a really cool story in the book about Mark Walton, the bass player. He had two basses, and his backup bass. He brought one bass with him when they left town. He just packed everything he had and just left with his family, and had 3 young kids at the time. And his backup bass, this Fender P bass, remained at the house. And Robert, the guitar player, had just been driving by when he went back to New Orleans after the storm, when he was allowed back in, and saw this bass, and this is maybe a couple of months later or something, just completely like swollen from water damage, just like leaning up against the house, and grabbed it, put it in a plastic bag. It had black mold all over it and stuff, and brought it to Memphis, where he had moved after the storm, and let it dry for 2 years, and then put it back together for Mark. It's a gnarly looking bass, but it's an amazing story. And when they reunited in '09, gave him the bass just before they were about to hit note 1, and they had to pause for 10 minutes so Mark could finish crying. Really heartwarming stuff, honestly. And they were, I think in a lot of ways, Katrina kind of brought them back together, at least as friends. There's a story actually Robert told me, because he didn't speak to Susan Cowsill for several years, and Susan's brother Barry Cowsill famously died in the storm. And there was like a memorial for Barry, and Robert showed up, and that was the beginning of their healing journey. And that kind of brought all of them back together as friends. So it was a devastating thing for all of them, but it was also kind of this unifying moment, I think.
And they came back together in 2023 for the Jazz Fest
Yep.
and did an incredible set. And now they've got this book. They've got to be tickled to death with this book.
Yeah.
And as I was saying to you earlier, for a bunch of drunks, they sure have good memories. Remember who the sound guy was in '82 at a club in Terry Hall? Come on, man.
Carlo had the best memory, which is the craziest thing.
Yeah.
You would think it would be so unreliable, but a lot of the stuff he told me, I'd go to ask other people, and they'd be like, that doesn't sound right. And I would ask somebody outside of the band, and they'd be like, no, that's what happened, yeah. He was right.
Carlo was right.
And he was kind of the hero of his own stories, but again, he was right about all that, so who knows. He would take issue with anti-hero. He would probably just say, like, no, I'm the hero of everything, but it's fine. He was Carlo.
He would have an opinion.
Oh, yeah.
Again, y'all, this book is called White Noise and Lightning, the Continental Drifter Story. Sean is going to hang out with us after the show, sign some copies, also the companion CD, some great music. Y'all are like me, I'm sure you missed out on it, so it's a great chance to catch up. One more time for Sean Kelly. Great book. You can tell all the hard work he put into it, too. He interviewed all of them, and like I said, the detail is amazing.